Hey, I recall Central Park in 1, 2, 3, 4. Ba-da-da-da-da-da-da. Do 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 do. Do 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 do. It's Wednesday. I'm in love. Perfect. Thank you. Right there. Hi. Oh, can't see my beautiful hair if I sit that close. I'm also trying to utilize this microphone better. Um, that's all. What was I talking about? Picks of the week. So we enter week 1939 of me not having a car. And normally I commute by bus to one of my jobs, one of my 9 jobs on Wednesday. And but I was feeling poorly earlier in the week, and so I got tested. I passed. Think negative, kids. That's how that goes. And so they told me though just to stay home from work until Friday, and so I rode the bus all the way into the beautiful San Fernando Valley to get my funny books, and it took 6 hours, something ridiculous like that. It's just getting to be. If there were not funny books at the end of this rainbow, I realized this a few years ago that I've definitely reached a point where I'm seeing somebody. I want you to know that right off. But there would be a time where I would only take the bus if I was going to get a little action. Not that I ever really had to, because fortunately for me, in my prime action years, I was a motorist. uh, if I were not seeing anybody and a nice lady called me up and said, "Hey, Jimmy, I'm calling you on this old landline. You want to come over and hop in the sack?" I'd be like, "Well, where do you live?" And if she said at the comic book store, I would already be knocking on her door. What am I on about? I feel very punchy. I have a lot of work to do, and I really just kind of want to go to bed. But business, right? We're professionals around here, as you can tell. Well, you can still see the whirlpool is still there, huh? Anyway, all right. So the funny book store today. This is another thing. I bought a lot of comics again, and it seems like it's only getting worse. And I really need to. I really like because I'm buying a lot of new books, and I've so far been really enjoying them. So I'm gonna have to start looking even more closely because even though I'm doing somewhat better financially these days, I still need to get a car, obviously. And whenever I am flush, it's like I'm Rodney Dangerfield at the horse track. Um, the one where what do they call the one? Look it up. Where it's the cart thing. I know what that's called. Phone lines are open if you want to call in and tell me what those horse races are called from Easy Money, 1983, starring Rodney Dangerfield and Joe Pesci. Anyway, caller, go ahead. All right, so yeah, all these books, or most of them anyway, are ones that I might not always get, but yeah. So first up, we have Swamp God #1. This is from the heavy metal publisher. This new imprint called Elements, which I asked Warren down at the shop what that meant, and he didn't know. I think what it is, because heavy metal is largely known. Heavy metal started in the 70s as a full size magazine, and it was a comic book, but they can get away with more. It was called adult fantasy because they could put boobs and swear words in it and stuff. Because since it was a magazine, it wasn't beholden to the Comics Code Authority. It wasn't intended for children anyway. It was intended for perverts. So somehow I got my hands on some. I think they used to keep it behind the counter with the penthouses, and I don't blame them. I guess. This is, and then they've definitely put out comic book size comic books since then. Definitely within the last decade, I bought several of them, but none of them have ever really hit. So I think this might just be another heavy metal as a magazine and institution has hung in there. It's not my personal favorite, but I do own a bunch, and it's another one of those kinds of because it's largely fantasy. So there's a lot of sci-fi thrown in. So it's one of those things where I like it, but in small doses. But this comic is written by Ron Mars, he's got to be like a 30-year guy now too. When I was a kid, he wrote Captain America and Silver Surfer. I think he wrote Captain, yeah. And Ron Lim drew both of those books with him, if I'm not very much mistaken. His Silver Surfer run, though, is still my favorite. Like, you can't really argue with the Kirby Lee Surfer and even the Buscema and Lee Surfer, although Jack does not care for that version whatsoever. But the Ron Mars Silver Surfer has always been my favorite because I was a kid and it was like my first. But also, I went back and I read a ton of those a few years ago. I'm still trying to finish out my run of that series, and it's just really, really good stuff. It really holds up well. It's very space operatic, like you would imagine, but also very funny. And yeah, I really like Ron Mars, and I hadn't read anything by him for a while. I don't know anything about this as per usual. Also, it turns out Ron Mars lives in the San Fernando Valley, speaking of which I didn't realize, but that's pretty cool. So Warren knows him and has talked to him a few times. And what did he tell me today? Oh, there was a character that Ron Mars killed off back in the 90s. Jeez, I don't remember now. He got death threats for it, though. And Warren was like, "Can you believe that?" And I was like, "Yeah, why wouldn't I believe that?" I remember, because I told him, I remember reading how Malcolm McDowell, who killed Captain Kirk, spoiler alert, in a Star Trek movie from 25 years ago, he got death threats. So, yeah, these guys are nuts out here. So, I'm looking forward to who gets killed off in that. I am so excited for this. Gru the Wanderer meets Tarzan. Why not? Why not? They did a Gru versus Gru meets Conan, I want to say, Conan, a few years ago, which I really liked. Because, I mean, Gru, I feel like I must have talked about Gru. Gru the Wanderer is drawn by Sergio Aragonés. Is a creation of his, which he created in Destroyer Duck was the first. Destroyer Duck #1 was the first appearance of Gru the Wanderer, which I own. In fact, at this point, I think I only have like 2 issues, maybe 4 issues of Gru left that I don't have. And 2 of them are very early from the Pacific Comics group based in San Diego, California, as I was for many years. And 2 from the end of the Marvel Epic run, which are those are harder to find because by that point they were not printing up as many. So they're kind of harder to find now. But the basic story is he is kind of a Conan parody a bit. Deadly swordsman, a complete idiot, and it's so much fun. Mark Evanier, who I've mentioned on here several times as being a Jack Kirby expert, really a comic book expert, but he worked for Jack Kirby and he's written books about him and stuff. He writes Gru along with Sergio. And it's like a weird, as a kid anyway, it was weird to me that it wasn't all just Sergio, but Sergio is a tremendous writer, but he doesn't write dialogue quite as well. So I think that's Evanier's thing. In fact, I saw them on a panel once when I was in high school together, and somebody asked them that, how does your guys' process work? And so they actually kind of acted it out. And so Sergio stood up and he's like, "Okay, so Mark," I can't do his accent. That was Italian, and Sergio is Mexican, so obviously. And he was like, "So then this, and then he goes this," and Mark would go, "Yeah. Stitch in time saves 9. Get it? What's the next one?" So that really, oh God, that was so funny. So yeah, this is fun. I also really like Tarzan. I think I might have mentioned this. It's an ebook, but I own the entire collection of Edgar Rice Burroughs Tarzan. I read the first book years and years ago, and I really liked it. And I really would like to get back into it. And this looks like it's of that era, like that Edgar Rice Burroughs era, because he's got the kind of longer hair, and he kind of looks like Bern Hogarth. I think Bern Hogarth drew the comic strip from the Depression era, and so that'll be fun. In that vein, we also have from the Marvel Comics group, Amazing Fantasy #1. This is by Kari Andrews, who is one of the rare, but he is a writer artist. So he's really, really good. He's got a very highly stylized style. I'm trying to go fast for a change. That's what she said. Cut that out. Amazing Fantasy was a book, a title that Marvel started printing in the 50s, if not early 60s. And it was originally Amazing Adult Fantasy, and then became Amazing Fantasy, and then Amazing Fantasy number 15, which was the final issue, was the first appearance of Spider-Man. So that's the kind of the end of, or the beginning of the Silver Age, especially for Marvel. But this, before there was a superhero in the book, it was a fantasy book, hence the title. And so in this story, let me if I remember this right, Captain America from World War II, teenage Spider-Man, and very young Black Widow when she was in the Red Room somehow end up in this other dimension, this kind of fantastical. I don't think it's weird world, which is a similar thing, but like that. And so they all end up there, and they don't know how, and they have to find their way home. Not an original idea. I've seen that done. In fact, I think they did that. Marvel did it just last year, or the year before, with the Avengers Defenders title. The name of that eludes me right now. But when characters from different eras meet each other, and in the current canon, all three of those characters know each other, but at this point in their lives, they hadn't yet met. And then they'll likely forget about it by the time they get back to their own time. But it promises to be fun. It's very obviously pulpy fantasy stuff, but with these superhero characters, it'll be neat. And then finally, from the upstart DC Comics, I have Detective Comics. I meant to say, I got two titles. See, this is the problem too, I think, because I bought that Batman Reptilian last week, which was great. I'll talk about that, I believe. And but now, every time I pick up a DC title now, especially if it's not one of the oversized Black Label books, they'll have ads for other DC books. I'm like, oh, I didn't know they were doing this, so now I got to buy these. So first, I have Superman and the Authority, which, there you go. That's all I need to know. Superman, you're aware of. The Authority was a book created originally for the Wildstorm imprint, and they were kind of an analog for the Justice League as well, but where they, hence the name, were they were like, hey, we're super powered and none of y'all are, so we're going to be running the show from now on. And it was a hit, and I've read a ton of it, but to be honest with you, the only characters that I ever really cared about were the Midnighter and Apollo, who were, and I mentioned this before, who are respectively Batman and Superman, but in this instance, they are also a gay couple. The Midnighter, though, became the real breakout character because he is super badass. He makes Batman look like Adam West. And I've always loved the character, especially in the right hands. And this is written by Grant Morrison, right? And so those are indeed the right hands. I believe Morrison wrote The Authority for a while, and I know he wrote Superman, and his Superman is incredible. Just give me a damn credits page, book. Well, Morrison's name's on the cover. I'm assuming it's Grant. Yeah, I'm going to free up storage space. Get off my back. And then also Blue and Gold, bringing old Booster Gold and Blue Beetle back together again. Booster Gold and Blue Beetle. Well, Blue Beetle was a Charlton character originally created by Steve Ditko, but he came when DC bought Charlton. Those characters, Blue Beetle and the Question, and there were Peter Cannon, Thunderbolt, and a bunch of those were folded into the DC universe. And then in the 80s, Booster and Blue Beetle became this kind of buddy cop team, and they've always been one of my favorites. Booster Gold is this egomaniac, over the top, and Blue Beetle is this. He's really just trying. Blue Beetle was the basis for the Night Owl character in the Watchmen. He just wants to help, and he's also filthy rich. So they make a great team, and there was Keith Giffen used to write them a lot in the 80s, and it was always fun. But even when they don't, it's been years. I mean, like back in, I want to say 07 was when 52 was going on. It was this year-long series that DC did, and they killed Ted, the Blue Beetle, right out of the gate, and I was so bummed. But, I mean, I'm sure he's been back for a while now, but I'm really glad to see them back together. And even Dan Jurgens is writing it, which is, he also wrote a lot of those stories. And also, this cover is reminiscent of those old days too, where it was just them. And then I'm even going to try to hurry up because my computer apparently has surgery in the morning. I also bought this today. This is a Shea, which is about the building and founding of where the New York Mets play. It's a biography of Che Guevara, the communist hero, written and drawn by Spain Rodriguez, who is one of my absolute favorites of all time. He was an underground artist in the 60s, and he didn't have as much sex and drugs. I guess there was a lot of sex in his books. The underground comics, their kind of legacy was that crazy hippie stuff, but Spain's work, along with, I might have mentioned this last week, in fact. Oh yeah, because I was talking about these books. Spain's work was more gritty and just more crime fiction and just incredible stuff. He's always one of my favorites. He passed away in 2012, I want to say, and I was heartbroken. But I didn't know he had done this, so I'm very happy to have found this. And I'm going to pause this now and get my computer situated, and then we'll be back. Hey, we're back in 2 and 2. Set this computer on fire, please, right now. Go get the. Yeah. Welcome back. We were talking during the break, but I wanted to make sure the audience at home. Never mind. I don't want to make the audience at home. That was Picks Out of the Week. Ba-da-ba-da-ba-da. You get the idea. We're going to go on to the next thing, because I've already gone way over. You can ask anybody. All right. I'm still very behind on comics. I did get a lot of reading done today, or this week, so what does that tell you? First up, Space Riders 1 and 2. This is Space Riders: Vortex of Darkness, and this was what I was talking. I was talking about the Spain last week because of these books. If you haven't read the first two series, you don't need to jump in, or you don't need to have read them to jump in here, but I would recommend doing it because they're good and the story will make more sense. But as with the other two series, they're essentially space opera, but very dirty. They're almost like biker stories, but set in space. And yeah, they're really fun stuff. Very dirty and gritty, and very much in the vein of Spain Rodriguez, as was this book, Apocalypse 5000. I think I said last week that this had been originally published in the 70s. It was actually the very early 80s, and now I don't remember where that was published. This was from Floating World. And yeah, they've been, oh man, this is a really, really fun, the New York City Outlaws. Yeah, that was the original book from the early 80s. God, it's set in here, and then I lost it. I'm going to lose it right now. Originally published in the New York City Outlaws 3 through 5. And I think I had to look it up online what year it was, but it was more in the 80s. But this was, yeah, in that same vein. It's very... When Spain was starting in the late 60s, and I don't know, maybe I'm projecting, because I've always kind of considered the biggest thing to come out of underground comics was unadulterated sex and drug use. But the violence, how could I have forgotten? But for whatever, I mean, maybe those weren't as sexy as well, then there's also the personalities of those artists really became, they became celebrities in their own right. Robert Crumb and Gilbert Shelton and Bill Griffith, and celebrities, but in a very underground way. Guys like Spain, and again, who wrote? Okay, now I have to just look it up, because I keep wanting to say Victor Moscosco, but he was more of a posters guy. S. Clay Wilson, that was his name. And also, now that I'm thinking about it, who was I want to say Robert Wilson, but that doesn't, no, Robert Williams, that's right. Wait, is it? Yeah, Robert Williams was another artist, but S. Clay Wilson is who I've been trying to think of this whole time. And their books had sex in them also, but they were definitely more the... It was as though those, I think Spain and S. Clay Wilson were doing underground comics that were closer in content to what you could find on the newsstands back then, but definitely not for kids. Definitely not even for, uh, um, you know, distinguished adults. They were, for scumbags, and that's some of my favorite literature. And so these books that I'm talking about are definitely in that vein, obviously purposefully, and boy, are they good at it. I guess this is in the same sort of thing as well. Cain and Abel. Oh God, this was probably my favorite thing that I read this week. Shaky Cain, as I said, is like Jack Kirby if he had been beaten as a child, and the other artist, Cain and Abel, who I was not familiar with before this book, but he has some other stuff out, and I'm definitely going to get my hands on it. I mean, he's definitely, look at that splash, dude. He's definitely in that same Spain vein. I won't do it all. Thank you. Write that down and then set that on fire. So yeah, I'm very much in this mode, and that reminds me, I have a book. Oh, gosh. Pirates in the Heartland by S. Clay Wilson that I haven't read yet, and I don't know if you can see this. That's author photo of S. Clay Wilson. Pirates was S. Clay Wilson's big thing. Spain's big thing was vigilantes. The Trash Man was his big character, but S. Clay Wilson, he wrote a lot of pirate stories, and he had a character called the Checkered Demon, which was very perverted, almost a stroke book on its own. I mean, the pirate stories were kind of, but that wasn't actually the book I was reaching for. But the one there it is. It's way too high for me. There's a book written in the 80s, I want to say, called A History of Underground Comics, which I got when I was in high school, and I've never actually read. I don't know how to put this delicately, but I couldn't get past the adult section of the book, so I'll have to, pull that down too. I'm trying not to buy as many books. I bought a couple here and there, not comics I'm talking about, and yeah, I've really been reading a lot. I think I finally have quit social media, and that's really freed up some reading time. Let me continue with these. Also, I read Batman Reptilian. It's good. I didn't realize either that, and this is Liam Sharp, who I had mentioned last week, was an artist. I'm not very familiar with his work, but he is a British artist, and this was originally supposed to be drawn by Steve Dillon. Garth Ennis and Steve Dillon worked together very, very often. Steve Dillon drew most of Garth Ennis's Punisher stories. Certainly the best ones, I would say. Well, Bourne was drawn by Derek Robertson, but when Garth Ennis first started drawing the Punisher, Steve Dillon was his artist, and then he stayed that way as regular artist for years and years after that. Bourne was a miniseries unto its own, and then occasionally another artist would come in and give Dillon a break, but yeah, Dillon was incredible, and he died very young. He also co-created Preacher with Garth Ennis, and yeah, Steve Dillon died in 2014 or 15, I want to say, maybe even 16. God. And so this was apparently originally meant for him to draw. And Liam Sharp doesn't have a very similar style at all, and it's still good. But if I, and it was this very touching little tribute at the beginning where Liam Sharp was like, "This is dedicated to Steve Dillon, who I really wanted to draw like," but Steve Dillon would have been like, "No, mate, you draw it your own." That's obviously not how Steve Dillon talks. But I kind of wish he it also feels, and this might be, again, me projecting, but Garth Ennis hates superheroes. He's made that very clear at this point. And so it's in some ways, this script feels like he doesn't really want to be here, which I don't blame him. The second issue came out this week, and I'm looking forward to that as well. But Ennis he's my favorite comic book writer of all time. He does have his moments where he's clearly not that into it. And it's whatever. It's still fun. Also, last week I read Moon Knight #1. This was a lot of fun too, but this was like one of the first books I read last week, so now I'm having trouble remembering what happens. So yeah, okay. At the end of the Age of Khonshu storyline in the Avengers most recently, Moon Knight finally just went out on his own. He still has the powers of the Fist of Khonshu, but he's not under Khonshu's control as much anymore. He's still in therapy because he still has multiple personality disorder. But now the left fist of Khonshu has showed up, and boy, they don't seem like they're going to get along. So that's going to be great. This is another thing, though, that I'm assuming Jed MacKay created that character for Marvel. You guys have got to stop doing that. I mean, again, maybe I'm nuts. Maybe I'm just still thinking like it's the 90s, but it just seems weird to create a character for a company, a publisher that has proven time and time again for almost 100 years that they are not going to share. Maybe they do now, though. I don't know. Speaking of sharing. I also read Ninjak #1. I think it's now at this point. I don't know if this was an original conceit in the book, but it should actually be Ninja K. He's the whatever the hell number letter K is, and he is a British fellow, which I think that was canon. Ninjak was never a character I cared about at all. In the 90s, he was, or he always seemed to me anyway, a very clear, just trying to cash in on the ninja craze, which even by the early 90s was on its way out. That mid 80s was really the height of ninja fever because Frank Miller introduced Elektra and the Hand in Daredevil, in the pages of Daredevil. And then you had the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and that just threw gas on that fire. Don't forget that fire. So, oh, that's okay. One more time for Paul Schaefer and the CBS Orchestra. Folks, coming up later in the program, we have Drew Barrymore and funny man Jeff Altman. But before we get to that, I'd like to invite anybody who works for the laptop division of Hewlett-Packard, come on down to the studio. I'm going to cram this laptop up your fucking ass, this thing. Guy sold me a fucking lemon. As I was saying, the story, the character Ninjak, I really honestly could give a poop about. The story in this was good because it's written by Jeff Parker, who not only is a very good writer, but who I haven't read in forever. I think he has been writing more Valiant stuff the last few years, which might explain why I haven't seen as much of his stuff. But he worked for Marvel for a very long time, and then he went over to DC and wrote Aquaman over there for a long time too. It might have been at the same time he was writing Marvel. Great stuff. I think I would rather see him do characters that I'm at least more familiar with. The real attraction in this book is Javier Polito by far. Javier Polito draws in this very, I don't know, it feels very 60s to me, even though comics weren't really drawn this way in the 60s. Maybe like a European 60s. But this was why he drew for the Human Target when Peter Milligan was writing it, because that had a very 60s vibe. That book was between Polito and Cliff Chang, and they don't have extremely similar styles, but they have a very similar vibe. And this maybe it's just been because I also haven't, I don't know, the last thing I read that Javier Polito drew might have been Human Target, and that's going on at least 15 years, if not more. It's just such good stuff. That completes the comic book portion of picks of last week. But there was some, I was feeling a little poorly earlier this week. I don't have COVID. We can all rest easy. I'm not the only one in my family who can say that. Hey, but I got to read some books. I keep wanting to call them big boy books because that's the joking way that I refer to prose, fiction or non. But I'm trying not to do that anymore because I've definitely, as proud as I am to be a comic book nerd, enthusiast is the term I prefer, I have definitely internalized a lot of negative attitudes towards comics, and calling fiction big boy books, even though it's joking, is still me sort of doing that, because comic books are big boy books too. Suffice it to say, I read 3 novels in the space of 2 days, and honestly, I just kind of want to brag about that. I hate thinking it today. I hadn't done that in a long time. I used for all through my 20s and well into my 30s, right up until like my mid 30s when I was working on my novel. This is when I kind of lost. I used to read a book a week from about the age of 19 until I was, I want to say 33 or so, 34. And I was not only proud of that fact, but I was smug about it. And so I hadn't done that. I mean, I haven't done that in a long time. I just don't have the time anymore. And I wish I could read on the bus. It would make my life so much easier and happier. But I get car sick. I remember there was one day in 2002 that I had all to myself. I didn't have to work. I didn't have any school. My girlfriend at the time was out of town, and that one couldn't get out of town far enough for my taste. So I didn't have anybody up my butt, and I sat and I read, I want to say 4 novels, and the only one I can remember is Four Past Midnight by Stephen King. But first up, I read The Winter of Frankie Machine by Don Winslow, and I've been recommending this to everybody. Don Winslow, the only other novel of his that I read was Savages, which was made into a horrible Oliver Stone film in 2011, I want to say, if not 2012. And yeah, that sucked. But Savages, the book, I read that in a sitting also because he writes, his prose is very snappy. So I was already a fan of his. I had this on my list for a while. My dear friend Frank Giuliano reminded me of it. He's like, you got to read this. Scorsese was on board to make it into a film, which I don't see happening now because it is in a very similar vein of The Irishman, and also Marty's pushing 80, so I don't even know if he's going to make another movie. So it's a mafia story. It's written by Don Winslow, already 2 for 2. It also all takes place in the city of San Diego, California, which is where I grew up. I never want to go back to San Diego, if I'm being honest. I'm so sick of it. But I still have, despite what my friend Dallas might think, I still have a very fierce and loyal devotion to that city, which I hated when I first moved there and hate now that I left. But there was a long time in between where I loved it. I loved it. I loved it. And so I already love fiction. I love mafia stories, especially. And usually they're set in New York or Chicago or Detroit, a more mafia city. And as he gets in, as learn, I mean, it's all fiction, but it lines up with the nonfiction I've read about the West Coast mob, which is that it all was central in Los Angeles. LA was like the hub. And San Diego had its own mob, but it was definitely not unlike in The Sopranos, considered to be another family in Los Angeles, the way the Soprano family was part of the New York mob. Frankie Machine, as you might have guessed from the title, or at least that I did, because I'm very smart, retired mafioso, but unfortunately finds himself in the middle of some more greaseball shit, as Henry Hill might say, and so has to come out of retirement. Unbelievably good. I can't stress it enough. If you didn't grow up in San Diego, I think you would still enjoy it. But Winslow, this is another thing too, is that like I say, I'm fiercely proud of my hometown, even if I don't care to live in it ever again. Maybe visit it at some point. But yeah, I just really like stories that take place where I lived for so long. And Winslow definitely did his homework. I think he must have lived there, or he certainly spent more than a few minutes down there, because his geography is flawless, and the characterization. Frankie Machine lives in Ocean Beach, and I spent a lot of time hanging out in Ocean Beach, and all the places that he goes to are all the gas lamp and all this stuff, all very familiar to me, and it's just there's an extra thrill to that for me. So The Winter of Frankie Machine, written in 2006. Can't recommend it enough. I also read these 2 books, both by George V. Higgins, The Rat on Fire and The Digger's Game. These are also crime novels. Not mafia. Higgins, if you're not familiar with George V. Higgins, I've been a big fan of his for a long time. And I bought these books in a fit after reading Kogan's Trade. So Higgins was Welcome to Literature Hour on Wednesday on the left. I don't care how long this is now. I'm already going to have to spend a half an hour editing it and uploading it. So we're all going to suffer. Also, my birthday's on Sunday. If somebody wants to buy me a new laptop, I would not. A laptop? That would be great. A laptop? What are you kidding me? My lap is filthy. George V. Higgins was an assistant district attorney. I don't know if he ever was district attorney of Boston, Massachusetts, but he grew up there. He practiced law there, and then in 1970 he published his first novel, which was called The Friends of Eddie Coyle, which was 3 years later adapted into a brilliant film starring uh, Peter Boyle, when he was kind of coming up, and Robert Mitchum when he was kind of on his way down. Oh, and just perfect casting. I mean, Mitchum is good in anything, but this was after he was a handsome movie star, and so he plays the title character of Eddie Coyle to a T. It's all dialogue based, and Higgins' ear for dialogue is infallible. And I've never been to the city of Boston. I honestly don't care for it, but I love crime fiction set in the film Departed. Speaking of Marty, and all it's such a seedy town, at least in popular culture. Maybe it's a beautiful place. I don't know. New England in general kind of gives me a. I feel like since they're on the opposite axis from me, from where I grew up, I'm like a little like. But the Boston accent is fascinating. I've always been really into dialects and accents and stuff, and the way people talk in different parts of the world. And yeah, Higgins just nails it. I've always the Coen brothers. Who else really nails it? Elmer Leonard, Cormac McCarthy. People who can really nail an accent. Oh, it's so great, and it's all dialogue too. And it's not even actually reading this stuff now because it's been a while since I read any Higgins stuff. When I read Kogan's Trade, I read that because that was the basis of the 2012 film Killing Them Softly, which is one of my favorites as well. Reading the books now again. It's not even dialogue; it's monologues. Like it's pretty much always two characters, either two cops, two criminals, or a cop and a criminal. And one of them just goes on and on and on and on, and they're always full of shit, and they're all completely unlikable characters, but they all talk. I can't stress it enough. Right on. I mean, the plots don't even really matter, and both of these stories are really. And Eddie Coyle was the same way, and Kogan's Trade was the same way. Kogan's Trade or Kogan's Game, I can't remember now. I have that as well, and I put Eddie Coyle on the reread stack because they read so quick. The plots are, like I was saying, the plots are, who cares what's happening? It's just listening to these guys talk about it. But it's all small time crooks doing small time crook stuff, and I don't know. It's hard for me, when I was just getting out of college, I was very grad school, even though I didn't go to grad school, and I was always thinking about, oh, what does crime fiction say about life in America and I don't care anymore. But I don't have a way to really. I don't know what it is about these books that just ring my bell. So Eddie Coyle was 1970, and then Higgins published a book every year of his life until he died in '99. I want to say. At End of Day was oddly enough his final book. Not great. That was the other thing too, is that these are from the '70s. Rat on Fire might be from the early '80s, but that was I think the '70s was definitely his prime. Because I'm reading Outlaws right now, which is from '87, and it's thicker. And I have this theory, and I again, I'm just speculating here, but in the '80s, especially once Stephen King became a bestseller, readers wanted, or at least publishers wanted, big books. So I saw this with Ed McBain. Ed McBain is another crime writer who I've loved since I was a teenager. They used to write these skinny drugstore paperbacks, and then once the '80s rolled around, people wanted the bigger ones. So it always felt to me like they were really putting more fat onto it, which isn't what I want. I want lean and mean. I have not burned through Outlaws like I burned through these, but yeah, if you're anything like me, and I have to assume that you are, if you're bothering to watch this, I think you'd really enjoy those books. And that was Picks of last week. Ba-da, ba-da, ba-da. All right, we'll be back with Tom Dreesen, but I wish. This has been Wednesday. I'm in love. See you next week. If I don't, go to hell and take this laptop with me. Thank you. Goodbye.